Today on The Conservative Rebel, the same left-wingers who called conservatives bigots for wanting to stop drag queens from reading books about transgenderism to children are claiming that conservative states' plans to put the Ten Commandments in schools are somehow unconstitutional. Apparently, it's perfectly fine to mass-indoctrinate children into the nihilistic LGBT cult, but not to teach them basic moral principles. Why is the left so militant about it? Because these laws would violate their inalienable First Amendment right to live in a godless bubble and never be exposed to any ideas they happen to disagree with, of course. The only problem is that that right doesn't exist. We'll discuss what the Constitution really says about religious liberty and why the Bible needs to be taught in public schools. You won't want to miss today's episode of The Conservative Rebel. Today we're going to talk about a very important battle in the culture war that not enough people on the right are talking about. And that, of course, would be the battle to restore Christianity to our schools. 16 states are currently trying to pass laws that would require the Ten Commandments in schools, and some are even exploring the possibility of teaching the Bible in their school curriculum. Earlier this year, Louisiana made national headlines as the godless Marxists at the American Civil Liberties Union dragged the state into federal court over its law requiring posters of the Ten Commandments in schools. And we're still waiting for the robed ones to decide whether teaching children basic morality is constitutional, so we'll have to wait on that case. But in the meantime, Texas is one of the states where conservatives are attempting something that is very similar. The Texas Tribune had this, quote, "A Texas Senate committee on Tuesday advanced bills that would require public school classrooms to display the Ten Commandments and allow districts to provide students with time to pray during school hours. The vote sends the two bills to the full Senate for consideration and is the latest sign of confidence by conservative Christians that courts will codify their opposition to church-state separation into federal law and spark a revitalization of faith in America." That much was made clear throughout the hearing as supporters and some lawmakers argued that the legislation would reverse what they see as decades of national moral decline. The vote comes amid a broader push by conservative Christians to infuse more religion into public schools and life. In just the past few years, state Republicans have required classrooms to hang donated signs that say, "In God We Trust," allowed unlicensed religious chaplains to supplant mental health counselors in public schools, and approved new curriculum materials that teach the Bible and other religious texts alongside grade school lessons. These efforts have come as the Texas GOP increasingly embraces ideologies that argue that America's founding was God-ordained, and its institutions and laws should thus reflect fundamentalist Christian views. Texas is one of 16 states where lawmakers are pursuing bills to require the Ten Commandments in classrooms. The bills have been strongly opposed by religious history scholars and some Christian groups, who argue that they are based on mischaracterizations of early American history and amount to coercion of religion upon students. Opponents also say that the Ten Commandments bill diminishes a sacred text by stripping it of its religious nature, and that introducing more Christianity into schools will exacerbate tensions and isolate Texas's growing number of non-Christian students. The first thing I'd like to point out is the dark irony in the fact that the left-wingers who are screaming the loudest about posters of the Ten Commandments allegedly violating religious liberty are the ones who called conservatives bigots for trying to stop drag queens from reading books about transgenderism to children. So obviously, the left doesn't care in any meaningful sense about religious liberty, especially not for Christians, because they not only stood by as this anti-Christian material was pushed in public schools, The leftist media actually organized a smear campaign to label Christians as authoritarians who wanted to ban books they disagreed with, or as dangerous bigots and all that. So the leftists trying to stop common sense laws like this one from being implemented don't actually care about religious liberty at all. All they care about is advancing their ideological agenda by whatever means necessary, and of course crushing anyone who dares stand in their way. But these people manage to intimidate a lot of Christians and conservatives into thinking that putting the Bible, or even just the Ten Commandments in schools, isn't some dangerous, radical, authoritarian thing. They try to intimidate us into thinking it's perfectly fine to mass indoctrinate children into cultural Marxism, atheism, and gender insanity. But it's not fine to teach them basic moral principles. And a lot of people will never question that logic. But today, that's exactly what we're going to do. And the first thing that I want to do is address the constitutional argument that you'll hear so often, the separation of church and state, the First Amendment, and all of that. And before I say anything, we're going to contrast what the First Amendment actually says about religion to what the left wants you to think it says about religion. So here, quoting from the First Amendment, this is all it says about religion. It then goes on to the freedom of the press and the freedom of petition, of course, but the first part of it is about religion. So here it is, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." One word into the First Amendment, and it's already clear that the left's interpretation of this text is insane. Congress is the subject of that sentence, as any third grader with a passing knowledge of language arts could tell you. The First Amendment doesn't say, the states shall make no law, Texas shall make no law, or that any county or city or school board shall make no law. It says Congress shall make no law. So clearly this law is perfectly constitutional. If you ignore the screeching of the leftists and do the thing you're not supposed to do, which is look at the Constitution for yourself for 4 seconds, that fact quickly becomes clear. And arrogant Ivy League egomaniacs, the leftist East Coast elites, like to pretend that this isn't the most obvious thing in the world, that it isn't obvious that Congress is the subject of that sentence. Sure, they'll say, the men who wrote the Constitution might have said it was Congress that shall make no law, but actually, they meant to say the states and the counties and the local school boards. They meant to say that all of America and every institution everywhere needs to be secularized. That's what they say. And who are we to say otherwise? We're, after all, just a bunch of miserable, ignorant mortals. We don't have magical pieces of paper from Harvard, and they do, so we should just shut up and accept whatever interpretation they try to cram down our throats like good little subjects. Because after studying at Harvard, your eyes are opened and you suddenly realize that the key to understanding the Constitution is to just ignore everything it says, apparently. But it would seem these same people slept through third grade English class, since they seem very confused about what the subject of a sentence is. All of that aside, here's how we can know for a fact that the interpretation of the First Amendment that these people are pushing is wrong. At the time that the states ratified the First Amendment, because it was the states that ratified it, every single one of them had established religious denominations that citizens were required to tithe to, or religious qualifications for office holders, and or government-paid salaries for ministers. Don't believe it? As one example, in Connecticut, the Congregationalist Church was the legally established church in Connecticut. It was essentially a state church. You were required to pay taxes to it. Your tax dollars went to fund this church and no other church, and it kept that For decades after ratifying the First Amendment, Connecticut kept that. So by the left's own standards, every single one of these states were Christian nationalist theocracies, and they remained so without anyone in the federal government making a peep of protest for decades. At the time of the founding, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, which were, by the way, some of the least strict states, required all office holders to believe in the Christian God and the authority of the Bible. Meanwhile, North Carolina, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Georgia, and Vermont went even further. They required all office holders to be Protestants. And here's the religious oath that the Constitution of Delaware required all political office holders to take. Anyone who was elected to anything, appointed to anything, had to take this oath, this declaration of faith in the Christian religion. And here it is. Quote, "I do profess faith in God the Father, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration." Can you imagine the thermonuclear reaction the left would have if Texas or some other conservative state required all of its elected officials to take that oath? You think it's absurd what they've done to Louisiana, dragging it into court, and how they're going to be fighting this Texas law? You think that's kind of an overreaction? Their reaction to a poster hanging on a wall? What would they do if this happened? They'd call it the death of religious liberty. They'd be in the streets, marching, screaming, beating their chests, ripping their hair. They'd think that fascism had come to the United States. It would be insane. And yet these states, they did this, and they ratified the First Amendment. Why? Because they understood that the First Amendment protected their right to do all this. Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that some crazy leftists would in the future interpret this amendment to mean that every single government institution, state, local, and federal, in the entire country had to be completely secularized. Never in their wildest dreams would they imagine that would be the case, and they never would have ratified the Constitution or joined the Union if they had thought that. They knew that the First Amendment was written to protect the states' rights to handle religion as they pleased, and to prevent the federal government from dictating from on high how the people of the states were to handle religious issues. So if it was constitutional for the states to do all that, to have these state churches and these religious oaths and all of these different things, obviously, it's perfectly constitutional for a state to put a poster that teaches basic morality. That, by the way, both Christians and Jews agree on, just so we're clear. It's perfectly constitutional for Texas to do that. Obviously, it's insane to say otherwise. You are ignorant or you are lying if you say otherwise. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is what establishment of religion means in the First Amendment. So what that meant, now that we understand that the First Amendment was written to restrict the power of the federal government, not the state governments, what establishment of religion meant was a government-chartered state church, like the Church of England, which was the legally established religious denomination of England that citizens were required to pay taxes to at the time. And the reason that the First Amendment prohibited that was not because the founders believed that government needed to be secular, but it was done in recognition of the fact that each state had a different religious climate. For example, in New England, they had in their roots the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and they had lots of Congregationalism and similar denominations going on down there. In the South, it was more conservative, Episcopalian, Anglican, that type of thing. And because each state had a different religious climate, the founders understood the potential for squabbling and fighting and persecuting each other over religion that could arise between the states that were so different in terms of their religious climate. And Protestants and Catholics, of course, had been fighting for 2 centuries in Europe. They had been persecuting each other and vying for control of governments for 2 centuries. And the founders wanted to avoid all that. They wanted to keep the peace. They didn't want people to be persecuted and the federal government to be infringing on people's rights. So they wrote the First Amendment to protect state sovereignty. What one state did would be very different than what another state did. What Texas does is different than what California does, in this area and in so many other areas. Just ask the swarms of people who have fled the crime-ridden hellhole we call Southern California and fled to Texas. But even operating on the assumption that the First Amendment was meant to apply to the states just as much as it did to the federal government, Texas's proposed law would still be perfectly constitutional, because it doesn't establish a Church of Texas. Texas isn't trying to pass a law doing that. It doesn't prohibit the free exercise of religion. Instead, it encourages it. So even under the most liberal, unnatural, counterintuitive, and strained possible interpretation of the Constitution, what Texas is trying to do is still 100% constitutional. Even if you somehow think that when the founders said Congress, they meant every state, local, and federal government everywhere, there would still be no sane constitutional objection to this law. It doesn't matter what the leftists want the Constitution to say. It doesn't matter what they wish the framers wrote or what they wish the framers meant. What matters is what the Constitution actually says, and how the people in the state conventions who ratified it and made it the supreme law of the land understood it. Saying that the true interpretation of the First Amendment is that everything needs to be secularized is to claim that it means the opposite of what the people who wrote it intended it to be. It's ridiculous. But people of different religions have to go to the schools, you might say. But first of all, Christians and Jews both agree that the Ten Commandments is God's word, God's law, and only morally deranged psychopaths would disagree with it. Who disagrees with, "You shall not murder," or "You shall honor your father and mother"? Who disagrees with that? And it is absolutely essential to understand the Ten Commandments and Christian values, to understand our civilization, our constitution, our culture, and our history. Our country was settled by Bible-believing Christians. Our political order was founded on biblical principles by Bible-believing Christians, raised to greatness by Christians, and preserved against all odds for 2.5 centuries by Christians. So atheists should have absolutely no problem with Texas's proposal to put the Ten Commandments in schools. Because even if you think God isn't real, or even dumber still, that every religion is somehow true at once, not only should you have no objection if your child is exposed to Christianity, you should rejoice at it, because understanding Christianity is absolutely necessary to be a well-rounded, intelligent, educated American. If you do not understand this, you do not understand anything about your country. And I don't hear you moaning about your child having to read A Tale of Two Cities or the Odyssey or other great works of literature, even though they're fiction and no one actually thinks they actually happened. So why exactly are you throwing a hissy fit about your kid just being exposed to a few lines of the Bible? Even if it wasn't the Word of God, which I obviously think it is, the Bible would still be the single greatest and most consequential work of literature ever written, ever in human history, by far. It has had a great influence on the lives of the greatest, most successful men in human history, and over the most prosperous and successful nations in human history. It is literally the building block of our entire civilization. And here's the kicker, we're not even making you read it. We're just putting up a few lines of it on a poster in a classroom. You don't even have to look at it if it hurts your feelings so much. So don't give me all this about, oh, I need to not be exposed to this, oh, people of other religions have to look at it. Because even if God wasn't real, American children would still have nothing to lose and everything to gain by being exposed to Christianity. If you truly cared about children receiving a quality education in any meaningful way, you'd not only love this law that's putting up the Ten Commandments, you'd demand that they be required to read the Bible at least once, even if you don't think it's true, just because it's such an important and historic book. And besides, Christianity makes people more responsible and moral individuals. I'm sorry, that's a statistical fact. There are loads of studies that show Christians are more generous and all kinds of things than the competition. So even if you don't believe in God, why would you be against your children believing something that makes them more generous? Why would you be against them learning something that gives them more meaning in life? Maybe you don't think it's true, but look at the meaning that it gives to people. Look at the results that it yields. Look at how it's making people more moral. Look at all of that. Why would you be against that? And in fact, why would you be militantly against that? And besides, in the past year, there have only been 7 verified cases of atheists spontaneously combusting because they happened to glance at a copy of the Ten Commandments, so you should have nothing to worry about. But out of abundance of caution, you could always try just not to look directly at the poster. But I have a right to be able to send my kids to a taxpayer-funded school that teaches my beliefs, and only my beliefs. That's what some of these people will say, but no you don't, you moron. What are you talking about? In your worldview, you can't have any rights at all, okay? In your worldview, the government and society gives you your rights. The government is the highest authority, so the government is all that can give you your rights. And guess what? If you live in Texas, the government of Texas has just decided that no, you don't have a right to be able to send your kids to a taxpayer-funded school that regurgitates your atheistic beliefs to them. So who are you appealing to when you claim you have this right that Texas is denying you? You're obviously not appealing to the Constitution or to the federal government or to the highest law of the land. We've already discussed how this is perfectly constitutional. So who are you appealing to? You've got no one. Rights can only exist if God exists. Your argument is so bad that you have to assume God is real in order to demand that schools teach kids that he isn't. But that's not even the part that gets me. The part that really gets me isn't the atheists and the secularists and the Marxists and all those people opposing the Bible in schools. Of course they're going to do that, obviously. What really gets me is the so-called conservatives and Christians who will lecture you about how teaching the Bible in public schools is still somehow a dangerous and radical thing. You know, the squishy, cowardly losers who will say schools should just be unbiased. They should just teach everyone's beliefs equally and let kids make their own decisions about what they want to believe. Teaching the Bible is a step too far, according to these types. But first of all, okay, maybe you think schools shouldn't be biased. But here's the thing. They are, and there's nothing anyone can ever do about it. You can't just wave some magical wand and suddenly every ounce of bias will disappear from every school across the country. These losers who are claiming that Christians need to let Marxist gender ideologues monopolize the public school system and indoctrinate millions of children into their perverted cult, how do they propose we respond to all of that? Oh, by doing nothing. They say we can't teach the truth in schools when all of this is going on, because in their rosy utopian vision of a perfect world, we'd all get along and schools would be unbiased. What will it take to wake these people up? We need to stop living in this fantasy world and accept that there is a very real war going on between good and evil and right and wrong, and neutrality is not an option. You are either on the side of good or you are on the side of evil. Choose your side and choose it wisely. So is teaching the Ten Commandments in public schools a step too far? Of course it's not. Tens of millions of babies are being mass murdered. Children are being mutilated. The nuclear family is crumbling. Playtime is over, okay? Politics is no longer this game of building roads or fixing potholes or building libraries or things like that. It's about whether children will be murdered or not. It's about whether kids will be mutilated or not. We either get with the program or we die. We need to stop being afraid to wield political power to fight evil, because evil people are not afraid to wield political power to fight good. We need to understand that when we show restraint and hesitancy to do things like teach the Bible in public schools, the left will never, ever return the favor. It's like some pacifist getting beat up by some deranged vagrant who just starts punching him and punching him and punching him, and he refuses to fight back because he has some idea that fighting back is wrong. That's what it's like. It's just as pathetic as that. And the left isn't afraid to use political power to advance their agenda. Of course they're not. If you doubt it, just look at what happened the past 4 years with 1,500 peaceful protesters dragged off to gulags and 23 pro-lifers robbed from their families and imprisoned for praying outside of abortion mills. They're not afraid to use political power, but they've managed to convince a lot of their enemies, a lot of conservative Christians, that it's unfair or wrong or even unbiblical to use political power to advance our agenda, especially when it comes to teaching children the truth. We can't use political power to fight evil, we're supposed to believe. We can't use it to fight for justice and truth and sanity, no matter how bad things get. The leftists are totally unafraid to use it, like I've said. They have this sophisticated indoctrination scheme where they're indoctrinating millions of children into leftism, while we stand by and do nothing. For the sake of survival, we need to start fighting fire with fire. We need to understand the end game. The end game is for them to indoctrinate a generation of voters that will forever secure leftists' grip on this country. That is their goal. And the solution to this problem, the only way to save us from tyranny, is very simple. There's this famous quote from John Adams that conservatives like to quote a lot, which is this: "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." What should our response be when we wake up and figure out that the left has been scheming to create a generation of soulless, immoral morons so that they can enslave this country? I'll tell you what our reaction should be. It should be to take back the schools and try to create a generation of intelligent, moral, functional Christians, because they will be impossible to enslave. That's what John Adams was getting at. If you're a dumb, immoral, irreligious person, then you're easy to enslave. If you are a moral and religious person, it's going to be much harder to enslave you. And whether the left likes it or not, millions of people are finally waking up to this fact. In Texas and in many other states, Christians and conservatives are finally realizing this truth. Parents everywhere are done with gender ideology and critical race theory being crammed down their kids' throats in public schools. And slowly but surely, American conservatives are beginning to realize that the only medicine that can fully cleanse the cancer of woke ideology from our schools is Christianity and the Bible. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Conservative Rebel. Please subscribe to our podcast, leave a like, and share. I'll see you on the next episode.